What if the most dangerous message in human history was never hidden, only misunderstood? A message copied by trembling hands, buried in caves, whispered across empires, and preserved through wars that erased entire civilizations. Not because it predicted a single disaster, but because it described a pattern. A pattern so precise that decoding it would force humanity to confront an uncomfortable possibility that history is not random. That our greatest crises may be echoes of a script written long before we arrived. And if that's true, then the question is no longer whether we are heading toward a turning point, but whether we are walking into it blind. Why does this matter now? Because for the first time in recorded history, humanity is globally synchronized. Economies move together. Information spreads instantly. Fear travels faster than truth. Ancient writers described moments when the world would feel compressed, accelerated, unstable, not as punishment myths, but as warnings about human systems reaching critical tension. Today we live in an age defined by rapid technological expansion, political polarization, and psychological overload. The past is no longer distant. It feels eerily present. When ancient texts spoke about cycles of rise, corruption, collapse, and renewal, they weren't describing isolated kingdoms. They were outlining human behavior under pressure, behavior we are seeing replay on a planetary scale. Among the most discussed prophetic writings is the Book of Revelation, a text often reduced to imagery of catastrophe. But strip away the symbolism, and what remains is a layered narrative about power, deception, social fragmentation, and moral fatigue. It describes societies intoxicated by excess, systems that centralize authority, and populations caught between fear and loyalty. The language is symbolic because the message transcends any single era. The beasts, seals, and trumpets function less as literal monsters, and more as archetypes, recurring structures of control, crisis, and awakening. The real warning is not about spectacle. It is about how human institutions behave when stretched beyond ethical limits. This pattern is not unique to one tradition. The Book of Daniel presents visions of empires rising with iron certainty and collapsing under their own weight. Each kingdom appears unstoppable until it isn't. The symbolism points to a repeating law of power. Concentration leads to rigidity. Rigidity invites fracture. When societies ignore internal imbalance, collapse doesn't arrive as chaos alone. It arrives as reorganization. Ancient audiences understood this intuitively. They saw prophecy less as fortune-telling and more as diagnoses. A mirror held up to the mechanics of civilization, and that mirror reveals something unsettling: that human systems consistently fail in predictable ways. Archaeological discoveries reinforce how seriously these warnings were taken. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain preserved commentaries showing communities actively trying to interpret signs of societal decay in their own time. They believed history moved in discernible phases, and that moral and political instability were signals, not coincidences. These groups were not obsessed with endings. They were obsessed with recognition, the ability to identify when a civilization was drifting toward a tipping point. Their concern was practical. If patterns repeat, survival depends on awareness, not denial. Now consider modern parallels. We live in a world where financial systems are interdependent. Digital networks shape perception, and authority is increasingly abstract. Global institutions like the United Nations represent unprecedented coordination, yet public trust fluctuates wildly. Technological acceleration outpaces ethical frameworks. Information ecosystems reward outrage more than reflection. Ancient prophetic language repeatedly warned about societies losing the ability to distinguish signal from noise. Today, algorithmic amplification and psychological fatigue create conditions where truth competes with spectacle. The resemblance is not mystical. It is structural. Human systems are again approaching thresholds where complexity breeds fragility. Here is the revelation hidden in plain sight. The message humanity was never meant to decode is not a secret timeline or a coded prediction of specific dates. It is the recognition that civilizations collapse less from external attack and more from internal misalignment. Prophetic traditions encoded this insight in symbols because symbols survive where plain warnings are ignored. Every empire believes it is the exception to history. Every generation assumes its crises are unprecedented. Yet the underlying pattern: expansion, excess, fragmentation, recalibration repeats with mathematical indifference. The forbidden knowledge is not about destiny. It is about accountability. Seeing the pattern removes the comfort of surprise. So what does this mean for us? If ancient warnings describe behavioral cycles rather than supernatural scripts, then the future is shaped by collective choices, not inevitability. Prophecy becomes less about fear and more about literacy. The literacy of recognizing systemic stress, moral shortcuts, and institutional overreach. Are we repeating old mistakes with new tools? Are we mistaking speed for progress? Are we numbing ourselves to signals that earlier cultures treated as alarms? The danger is not that history repeats. The danger is that it repeats unnoticed, disguised as innovation. The final reflection is not apocalyptic. It is diagnostic. Humanity stands at a convergence of power, technology, and vulnerability unlike any prior age. Ancient voices were not trying to terrify the future. They were trying to teach pattern recognition. Their message suggests that awareness is the only true safeguard against cyclical collapse. The question is whether modern civilization armed with more information than any generation before it is capable of listening. Recognition requires humility, and humility is historically rare at the height of power. And so the signal remains, not a prediction carved in stone, but a recurring transmission embedded in history itself. Civilizations fall when they stop examining their foundations. The message was never meant to frighten humanity, it was meant to awaken it. The pattern is visible, the echoes are measurable. The choice to decode it or ignore it belongs to us. And if this transmission has reached you, then the investigation is no longer ancient history. It is happening now.